for our first chat. Come on down, just like a game show host, and join in on the information about our 1700 stained glass window that's been hidden away in the cellar for 50 to 100 years. Just amazing. So I am Kristen, a church lady. And about, I think it was December this past year, I realized that, gosh, we need to find out more and stabilize the stained glass in the basement. And so the project began. As we started unveiling 24 different trays of stained glass, we realized that there was quite a mystery unfolding. And so today, I would like to share that mystery with you. The story of stained glass itself begins in the 17th to the 19th centuries during the Anglo-Saxon period. By the 13th century, the craft of stained glass design and manufacture had greatly increased. During the Middle Ages, when stained glass really peaked, is because basically people were illiterate, and they were the stories of the Bible. As time went on, stained glass became symbolic of Catholic supremacy. And therefore very unfortunate, because King Henry VIII targeted the destruction of the religious images. And in 1574, a royal decree went out, and it said, take away, extinct, and destroy, so that there is no memory of the same in walls, stained glass, or elsewhere in churches or homes. And as if that wasn't enough, my gosh, 1600s was the rise of Cromwell and the Puritans. And of course, they perceived that the stained glass was brightly colored glass as gaudy and self-indulgent, and therefore highly heretical. So further purification happened. Political forces not only proved disastrous for the existing stained glass, but also for its manufacture. The Lorraine forest, for example, provided furnace fuel as well as alkali, which of course is ash from the wood, that became a highly specialized stained glass manufacturing area. And then, of course, the Rhine River that flows through was able to transport that glass mostly to England. The 30-Year War, unfortunately, scattered the glassmakers and raised the furnaces from being the major source of colored glass and it was the end. So artists improved, and they started painting on white glass with vitreous, powdered glass, and enamels. The art of stained glass evolved, and in the 17th and 18th centuries, treating windows just like a translucent canvas painting with lead strips to simply hold glass shapes together. This is where our story begins, with Sir Joshua Reynolds, who collaborated with Thomas Jarvis to create the prototype for our window. And so here you might know Joshua Reynolds. He was in the mid to late 1700s. He was an English painter specializing in portraits. He was one of the major European painters in the 18th century. He was the founder of the first president of the Royal Academy of Arts. He was also knighted by King George III in the mid-1700s. His father was a Balliol College, Oxford professor. But unfortunately, Oxford was known, it was the oldest college, it still is, the oldest college in the English-speaking world, and it's also known to generate ideas and educate people who seek to change the world for the better. And although the father did not send any of his sons to this college, Joshua came to the idea through his art and teaching to lead Britain away from his homegrown style of painting and towards a more formal and continental grand style, where artists would be romanticizing or making perfect their subjects. Years later, this prototypical type of painting became known as swagger portraits, as we see in the center. I like that, swagger portraits. So Thomas Jarvis, as the next slide shows, was a native of Dublin, and he began his art painting career on glass, assisted by his chemical studies. In 1770, at St. Agar Parish Church in Ireland, examples of the most extraordinary and different applications of stained glass, applied in some places to use extra sheets of silver leaf as well as layers of glass, sometimes painted, sometimes stained. And this process had an effect of enhancing the richness of colors as well as a noteworthy pioneering technique. You can see it in the center there. So that's an enlargement of the main topic. And there's 5 or 4 different panels of glass that are shown in that slide. Shortly after completing this window, Thomas moved to London and rapidly established his reputation as a small-scale, finely detailed panels, generally copying Italian, Dutch, and Flemish masters. He specialized in moonlight, firelight, and frost that were made from transparent glass and made it opaque. In the 1776, Jarvis held an exhibition of his stained glass works to show this atmospheric treatment of stained glass. The next slide shows that an exhibit must have captured Joshua's imagination, for shortly after, they began creating the west window in the new college chapel in Oxford. And this is a piece of it. You'll see the boys here on the far left. They are the sitters, Reynolds as well as Joshua and Jarvis. Now, Reynolds was in 39 portraits as a sitter, and he was associated with another 1,420 different portraits in one way or another, whereas Jarvis only sat for 2, and this is one of them. So there's a close-up of it, and then that circled bit is actually the nativity scene in the college window, and it has both of them as shepherds. In the next slide, we see that the whole window was widely admired at the time. The figures in the upper set of windows with the little circle on it are dramatically rendered and almost monochromatic tones, giving a sense of sublime as well as being marvelously atmospheric. That, at least, was one critic's comment. The lower 7 are the gals below that darker panel, and they're called the 7 cardinal virtues, and they are enamel painted windows. Another critic called them third-rate actresses. Can you believe it? Prior to installing these glass panels into the new chapel, Thomas decided to exhibit them in a darkened room. Can you imagine? Just to show the colors as Sir Joshua had designed, and what a great effect it had. The atmosphere, the romance, the impressions. However, when they were placed in the wall in the chapel, the brightly backlit effect disappointed even the artist, his own anticipations. Next slide shows, in efforts to understand the contrasting styles in stained glass at the time, on the left, you will see a Sir Joshua Reynolds and Jarvis. The gal's name is Fortitude. And this is a window from the window in Oxford. And on the right, of course, is our familiar William Morris's colleagues painting in the St. Cecilia Church in Oxford. We can see that Jarvis's uses an enamel paint on clear glass, 2 things that are unique, and he also did a very functional grid line of lead to hold the window together, as opposed to Morris's, whose actual stained glass, the leading followed the pieces, and therefore emphasizing each aspect of that design. So therein lies a magnificent difference, and why Jarvis is really a standalone, whereas we're very familiar with the other type or style This book can be seen in the stained glass room to my right. To my left, your right. The next photo, we see that as a result, the new chapel window is probably the most debated stained glass window in the history of stained glass. If it were an oil painting, the end result would have been magnificent. But unfortunately, when copied onto enamel glass, the painted glass was no longer translucent, later deemed less successful, shall we say, in situ. The universally attacked window from the 19th century on, these scenes were deemed to be entirely wishy-washy and on rectangular panes of glass with a very few lead lines. And yet today, we are looking at a rare glimpse of the style of stained glass which was once so very popular and yet today practiced so very little. The technique of enamel painting is all but lost, making conservation an enormous challenge. In this next slide, we see, although very difficult to clarify, on the left is in fact the original window in our east side of the church. And I tweaked the image from when it was relocated to the west side and removed the upper stained glass so that you have an idea of what that original window looked like. It was 2/3 of the window rather than the top portion that still remains today. The unfortunate smash, an article somewhere we think between 1870 and 1880, states the valuable and much admired painted window in the west end of the church has met with an unfortunate mishap in carrying out cleaning and decorative work that's now in progress. Unfortunately, one of the masons slipped and smashed the center panel representing the resurrection. Luckily, the main portion of the subject has not been destroyed, and every effort will be made to repair the damage. We believe this is a Soulby's Advertiser newspaper article. We do not know if that window was actually resurrected in the west wind at what time specifically, but we do know it was done during Bardsley, Canon Bardsley time, which is about 1880 to 1890, a 10-year period, and it was made as a memorial to a gentleman named Hodgson, who was on the Neville Estate trustees. And he lived right down the street here, actually, on Britton Place, on Church Walk. What we do know is that the center panel representing the resurrection, both on the left, go back one slide if you'd be kind, there we go, on the left and in the center. So on the left is the newspaper article from 1980, and in the center is a photograph of what you can see here. If you look carefully, you'll see that the top is a delicate stained glass enamel painting, and you'll see the bottom is a different leaded image. And what you're seeing is that is the renovated piece that was done about 100 years later after the unfortunate smash. Both of these are available for your view. And, yep. Oh, and that's the article on the right. There we go. And you can see the article in the book in that same room. The central figures of the resurrected Christ was restored in 1880, and I quote, by a ham-fisted renovator who repainted and re-leaded the whole set in mild steel, which has since corroded, causing the thin panels of glass to twist and crack. Movement in the building and more rusting over the years has created, unfortunately, decay and disrepair, and that's a 1980s article. So let's look at the windows panes below of 4 evangelists that are noted to be made by the Grey of London, and they are represented and they were installed by Brattle, who was of Conishead Priory. Now, I don't know if you're aware, but Ezekiel had some striking visions in the Old Testament. And in the last book of the Revelations, he had visions very similar to the evangelist of John. And there were 4 beasts that were sitting beneath God's throne. Over time, these beasts came to represent the symbols of our 4 evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Artists have since simplified these very complex forms with multiple wings or heads, and now they are all based on Ezekiel's original vision. So this is Matthew. This is Matthew, the slide, with a winged cherub or an angel whispering above him. The angel came to represent Matthew because in the New Testament book that he wrote, it opens with the human descendants of Jesus, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, by way of the son of David, by way the son of Abraham. The light green stained glass that you see on the right, go on back, thank you, on the right and left are actually on either side up here. So you can come up through the stained glass and look at these lights of glass with the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as well as their symbols on the side later. Thank you. The next slide. That would be Mark, who's depicted with a lion, and he's emphasizing the royal dignity of Christ. Mark opens his book with the cousins of Christ, which of course is John the Baptist, roaring like a lion in the wilderness. While other Gospels may include many details, the Gospel of Mark briefly sets the stage for Jesus' baptism by his cousin, John the Baptist. This is, I would suggest, the most complete panel we have in the cellar. Notice the soft flowing draperies that are depicted by the soft enamel painted edge instead of that heavy line that we saw earlier in Christ's body. The next slide, and you can of course see all these here to my left, your right. The next slide is Luke, and you will see that Luke has an oxen, which is historically a sacrificial animal. Because Luke's gospel stresses the significant nature of Christ's ministry, he opens his book with Zechariah and his wife being told that they're going to have a son, even though Zechariah and his wife are late in age. Their son was John the Baptist, Jesus' cousin. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you are to call him John. He will be a joy and a delight to you, and many who will rejoice because of his birth, for he will be great in the sight of the Lord. No matter how closely we look at these faces, the technique, the manner of expression, the line is incredible. And you can see all these faces over here as close as you choose. And the last one is our stabilized John in the window. He was stabilized in 1981, and he has an eagle to symbolize him. This creature dwells closest to heaven, and John's vision offers a heavenly opening in his gospel, and I quote, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning, and through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and the life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness shall not overcome." So those are the 4 evangelists, and this one actually had a cold process. They made a mold of the stained glass for the outside. They made a mold of clear glass for the stained glass and made a sandwich so that those pieces that we see are actually suspended, untouched, between 2 plates of glass. If we were to smash the clear glass, the painted glass would fall away untouched, and that is the preservation value of what was done in 1980. The next slide It was suggested that the damaged panes were removed and stored during the time of Reverend Rimmer. Reverend Rimmer is commemorated by the very modern-looking stained glass over here, and we have folks in the congregation today who worked with Reverend Rimmer as a youth group leader, and he does not remember the stained glass being anything but vacant and taken away. And so we feel that the stained glass that was damaged and removed occurred early on, so somewhere between World War I and up to the 40s. It's been said that these stained glass panels were repainted every 20 years, and we'll learn why. Now I had the grace to interview Bernard Ellis, who is actually the renovator of that and several windows in this church. And as a 38-year-old, Bernard returned to Ulverston from London, having graduated with a certificate in stained glass and a diploma in technical glass technology of Hounslow College in London. It was at this time that he met stonework specialist Nicholas Fairplay, who was working on the St. Paul's Cathedral pinnacles. His early projects with a company of 4 persons, all called the Cumbria Studio Galleries, included not only the St. George's Church in Barrow, but Ulverston Parish Church. In 1980, an article is stated by Bernard saying, "One of the windows in Ulverston Parish Church is in fact a national treasure. The picture is of Jesus with 2 young ladies on either side of him. The window is only 2 millimeters thick and is unusual because the panes of glass are so large that seldom feature is seen in a stained glass. The different technique that's made with this stained glass, they would actually create a large, he calls it a sausage of stained glass. They would cut off the ends and they would cut down the center of that sausage and lay it in a kiln, and it would slowly unfold to create the large 24-inch wide panes of glass that we see today. None of these pieces of glass could be fired in this area or possibly in England because they just don't make kilns that big. People don't do stained glass on this scale. Another very unusual aspect of these windows. The journalist asked, over the years, here we go. Bernard told us that it's not just the age and the vandalism that's reduced the windows to such a poor condition, but rather that the iron of the original construction, the poor restoration work that was done by the Victorians, who used steel instead of lead, concrete instead of lime mortar, which ruined the panes and the stone when the steel rusted and expanded. The stonemason further said that over the years, iron has rusted up to 10 times its original side. So it actually split out the stone of that window, if you can believe it. And so in 1980s, they had to remove all the stone from that window. After they took out the window, they took the stone away. And a fellow church member, Frank Musker, had stone installed there from his business in Lindell. And that took about 3 months by this stonemason from London. The journalist asked Bernard, the stained glass, so actually how is it made? He said, well, to begin with, the glass can be colored or clear, the surface can be painted with enamels or oxides, and then placed in a furnace. The heat must be over 300 degrees centigrade. And that allows the surface of the glass to melt. And that paint then melts and goes down into and through the color of the glass. The flux, which is a ground piece of glass in the paint, changes the color once it's heated. So next slide shows us that a second reference article that was given to me by Bernard was actually published in 1981. And you can see on the far left that there's a ladder on that window because that's when he's taking pane glass out of the window. It's a mystery how this glass in the northwest window was actually stained. The technique has been lost since the 18th century, and no one actually knows how it was done. This type of work is very rare because very little stained glass and painted glass was made in the 1800s. The only other window even similar to this one in the parish church is from Salisbury Cathedral by a different enamelist named Francis Edginton, but also the one we've spoken of earlier in the New College Chapel by Thomas Jarvis. And of course, Reynolds was the designer for both of those. Bernard repaired several of the windows in our church. We're going to do a little tour of those now, just to contrast the different styles. So the Kristen window on your left, my right, was rebuilt by Bernard. It's a Shringley and Hunt of Lancaster. It's an archetypical, go to the next slide if you'd be kind. It's an archetypical Victorian window. It has Christian characters on it. One of the fellows in there is David. He's on the left. He's the fellow with the harp. You might know David from David and Goliath. And you also might know that he was the writer of the book of Psalms. And that's a book, of course, of sacred songs and poems. But he was also King David of ancient Israel and Judea. And the other fellow in there is Isaiah. And he was a visionary in the Bible who foretold the coming of Christ 700 years before Christ was actually born. And so those two persons relate biblical characters from the story of the Bible so that illiterates and others can appreciate all that has happened. The next windows are a variety of windows. So in back, behind these pipe organs, is one set. The second set actually came as you came through the front door, and the third set is overhead in the clerestory or clerestory. Several windows are attributed to actually Reverend Canon Gwilym, who oversaw the last major renovation of this church in 1866. Just as a side note, the entire restoration of the church cost £10,000 in 1866. My husband, bless him, did a little calculation, and he said that would be approximately £1,070,000, £1,780,000 today. Ulverston had become an incredibly prosperous town, exporting local iron ore among so many other materials. The wealth of the area is reflected in the fine collection of stained glass. Most of these that you see here are, in fact, from the 1866 restoration. We'll discuss one pattern of Victorian window, if we be kind. On the left, you can see the one panel with the two blocked out. And I believe that that's the original window. And there are 7 more panels, not just the 2 blocked out, but 7 more in the cellar. But from those 7 or more panels that were removed from that stained glass, Bernard made the 4 stained glass in the entry. So in a sample of that is the middle one with a little bit of a round top. And Bernard installed that in 1979. And then on the right are the clerestories, or clerestories. And the idea is that a clerestory is what emits light into the church, as they're doing even today, allowing the ceiling to rise, if you will, visually. You'll see that there's a blue set, an amber set, a green set, and a ruby set. And they rotate through the 7 windows on the south and the 7 windows on the north. And they're stunning pieces again. If we look at the next slide, we'll see that the patterns that are akin to all these windows are very familiar. Fleur-de-lis on the left, oak branches in the center, 2 different types, and on the front right is IHS, of course, is Greek for Jesus. These windows are extremely unusual in the Victorian times, as they were patterns rather than stories, as we saw earlier, of biblical vintage. So the next window is a very unusual window, and it's in the chapel here to my left, your right. And we don't really know how old it is. But because it's not religious, We think it survived King Henry VIII's destruction. Interesting. So formerly, this was in the Brattle Chapel in their family home. But it was relocated here, and it was enlarged with a little bit of a trim around the side, as you can see in the slide, as well as the window itself. And we ended up calling this originally the Brattle Chapel for the family, the window. And actually, this tomb with the knight is related to Brattle as well. And this Sands monument was, in fact, on the east wall when it first arrived. But this now has 20 coats of arms, and it's unusual in that it is not recognized by the law of arms. It has not only the husband's, but the wife's coats of arms. So she must have been a powerhouse to put in bragging rights, if I may be so bold. And this third set of windows, now in contrast to the enamel painted on the clear glass in the back, over the cafe, or these leaded windows all around, this window shows the development of a family tree, and we certainly believe it was therefore spared from destruction because it was not religious. The last slide we have here is replacing what is now the clear glass on the south wall. This was actually a gift by a niece and 2 nephews from the Jacksons, John and James Jackson, who lived just off of Church Walk here as well. What we see here is that this is a double window of bright colors showing 2 panes of Jesus walking on the water. It's a fashionable mosaic window with medallions and again a grisaille, they call it. So when they did a hatching of dark lines to give shade and shadow to an otherwise very bright window. The top portion of this window can be seen. As you might imagine, these stained glass pieces are very heavy. So we put pieces on plexiglass, small pieces, and or if it was a leaded piece of glass, we put only the smallest pieces out because we have a piece of material here that just can't take the weight. So I'm so pleased that you came to hear about these stained glass windows, about the uniqueness of our church due to those stained glass windows, and the mysteries that we hold in our cellar. My husband, bless his heart, has been building trays since January. He's built 19 of them. We will have 24 wooden trays holding 24 panes of glass that will be stored, in essence, in a baker's rack down in the basement where we found these pieces originally standing on edge, in wooden boxes, in cardboard boxes, or wrapped in carpet. And because of the humidity in the cellar, we thought the stabilizing project was worthwhile. So I thank you and enjoy the day. We have some fantastic speakers, and we have Dan coming up here within a few minutes. So do stay tuned, buzz around and look at the wonderful exhibits. Thank you.